Revelation chapter 6. We're going to start in verse number 3, and then that will go down through verse number 8. So Revelation chapter 6, starting verse number 3, says, "And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, 'Come and see.' And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, 'Come and see.' And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, 'A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine.' And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth." And so here we are at the second seal here in verse number 3. And if you remember back to last week, the first seal was a time of peace, but it was also a time of deception, because what is being promised is a worldwide, global, lasting peace. And that's just not the case. That's not what happens. And so but there is a time, a brief period where there is actual worldwide peace. And so after this particular time, now with the opening of the second seal and the sending of the second rider, that time of peace is going to end. And this is exactly as we see what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24. And again, if you remember back to this, Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, they really go hand in hand. And in Matthew 24, it says, "And Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." And so there was a time of deception under that first seal. Now, as I said, the deception wasn't that there would be peace, because there was. The deception was that there would be lasting peace, and that certainly was not the case. Now, we don't know how long this time of peace actually lasts, but given that, and we talked about this, I believe, a couple weeks ago, given that the first 4 seals are open in the first half of the tribulation, it would be a time less than 3.5 years. And so the interesting thing here is that the world is going to be duped into thinking utopia has finally come, and in a short time, war is actually going to cover the earth. And so when the second seal is broken, obviously the next rider comes. And as we talked about, these riders are not so much individuals as they are movements. The first one being a movement of peace, and now the second being war. And we see there in verse number 4 that this rider was on a red horse. And so given the context of this particular rider, it seems very likely that this horse, the color the color of this horse is to represent the bloodshed of war. Seeing how that is the movement of this second rider. And then we see also there in verse number 4, it says, "And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon." And so this rider will have power, but interestingly, power that is not his own. This power is given to him, and the insinuation is that it is given to him by the one that is opening the seal, and so by the Lamb, by Christ himself. And that makes perfect sense, because this is his judgment. Again, he was the only one found worthy to take the seal, and so this is his judgment. He sends the rider. He therefore empowers this particular rider to do the things that are outlined in this seal, in this judgment. And so Christ gives him the power to do those things, nothing more, nothing less. Now, and I just wanted to point this out quickly, this is contradictory to those who want to say that the church endures part of the tribulation, because there's a large group of people who will say that the church endures either some or all of the tribulation, because what they will say is that, particularly those who say that the church will only endure maybe the first half, they will say that the first half does not include the wrath of God, that the first half is really just the wrath of man. And so, they'll say war. That's always been around. That's something that is man-made. But here, this verse really contradicts that, because it clearly proves that this is God's wrath being poured out through these judgments, because it's His power that is going through this particular writer to give him the authority that is to come and do the things that he is going to do. Now, we know that the Bible tells us that the believer is not destined for wrath. A couple of verses, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, for God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ. Romans 8:1, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus. And so we can know assuredly from these particular passages that the believer is not destined for wrath. And so if these seals, if these particular judgments are in fact the wrath of God, then that in and of itself is proof that the church will not be there. And so we believe that is to be true, as the church will be raptured out before the tribulation, not at the midpoint and not at the end. And so this specific power that the second writer has there, here in Revelation 6:4, the specific power that is given to him was to take peace from the earth, to take peace from the earth. And so as there will be global peace, now there is going to be global war. He's not taking peace from the Middle East. He's taking peace from the earth. This is going to be everywhere. Jesus speaks to the scale of this particular warfare again in Matthew 24. He says, for nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, there in Matthew 24:7. And so again, he speaks to the scale of the worldwide global war that will be taking place once the second seal is opened. And so unlike the conquering of the first writer, who does so through the means of diplomacy, and that's what happens under the first seal. The second writer, the second seal, I think is pretty clear that the conquering is going to be done through bloody warfare, again, insinuated by the red color of the horse. And so it says there again in verse number 4, they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. And so obviously warfare and bloodshed are insinuated through these kinds of passages. John MacArthur, writing about the sword itself there at the end of verse number 4, he says, this is the word that is used for the soldier's sword, the one they carried into battle. It is also used often for the assassin's weapon. It depicts war and assassination and rebellion and revolt and massacre, essentially deadly force involving slaughter and death. That is the intent of the great sword. And so the deception under the first seal was that there is going to be this lasting worldwide peace, and then the second writer comes onto the scene and he takes that peace from the earth, and people understand that what they thought was finally going to happen. Everybody champions this thought of peace, and they're going to think that they've achieved that, and that's going to be taken from them once the second seal is opened. But let's continue to go on, and let's look at the third seal in verse number 5. It says, and when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. And so this time John looks and he sees a black horse. Now, an interesting note on this, in Lamentations chapter 4 and in chapter 5, there is a correlation made there between the color black and famine. And so these two go together in these particular texts. Let me read them for you. Lamentations 4, verses 8 and 9. It says, their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones, and so they're malnourished. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It has become like a stick. They that be slain with the sword are better than they that be slain with hunger. For these pine away, stricken through for want of the fruits of the field. And then in the next chapter, Lamentations chapter 5, verse 10, it says, our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. And so we there see in Lamentations a correlation between the color black and famine. And this is exactly what we see here again in Revelation chapter 6. Now, the famine, and I think this is just logical, but the famine seems to be the natural result of another world war. Now, if we think about this just from our particular point of view in the 21st century, malnutrition is already a problem in a lot of parts of the world today. And so we can only imagine how something like that would be ramped up after another global war, or even in the midst of a global war. And then to add on top of that, it is no secret that should another war, or rather when another war of this scale breaks out, it should be no secret to us that there will be biochemical warfare. Most countries that are developing these kinds of weapons today are including biochemical weapons on these particular missiles and things like that. And so, should another world war break out, the weaponry that would be used, I think, would do quite a bit of damage, not just to humanity, but to the earth itself. So it stands to reason that there would be significant harm done to Earth's crops and natural resources and things like this that would naturally lead to a global famine happening as a result of the war going on under the second seal. And so again, as we see in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gives us the same order of things. He talks about the deception, which is the peace, and then he talks about the war, and then after mentioning the wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, he says in that same verse, Matthew 24, he says, and there shall be famines. And so again, we see that Matthew 24 and Revelation 6 are really going hand in hand here. Now, John sees this particular writer holding a pair of balances in his hand. You see that there in verse number 5, at the end of verse 5. And so these balances really speak to the seriousness of the famine that's going to take place. Food will be in such scarcity that weighing and rationing become necessary. And so there was events such as this after both world wars, as far as I understand, and we can only begin to imagine after another world war with, again, the kind of weapons that are available to nations today to use. We can understand how this famine would really take place on a global scale, unlike anything that's ever really happened before. And so people are going to be enduring these wars. People are going to be enduring this famine. And then it says that John hears a voice in the midst of the four beasts there in verse number 6. And this voice, now it doesn't state exactly who this is, but I think it is really safe to assume that this is God speaking, because you see there again in verse number 6, I hear a voice in the midst of the four beasts. And so this voice is coming out of the middle of the four beasts. And we know back in Revelation chapter 4, chapter 4, verse number 6, that these beasts are surrounding the throne of God. And so there he was in the midst of them, and it makes sense that the voice coming out of the midst of them here would be the same as well. So we just assume, and I think rightfully and safely assume that this is God speaking. And so he talks about this famine, and he says his message is a measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny. Now, according to a parable in Matthew chapter 20, we can rightly surmise that a penny, or sometimes you'll see the word denarius used for this, that a penny was 1 day's wages, that you would work a full day and you would get a penny or a denarius. Now, therefore, it would take a day's wages to buy a measure of wheat. 1 measure of wheat, just by the estimates of the Greek and everything that has been used, 1 measure of wheat would roughly equal enough to feed one man with as they describe, a moderate appetite for 1 day. And so 1 day's wages is enough to feed one man for 1 day, or 3 measures of barley, which was a lesser food, but it would be enough to feed, they estimate, 3 people for 1 day. And so we can understand how families will be in very sincere need of food, and money is just not really going to be able to get them what they need during this particular time. It is going to be a destitute famine. And so essentially food around the world is going to be scarce as it becomes expensive, and they are rationing out this particular food as a result of the famine and this particular writer. Now his message also states this: and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. And I'll tell you that this is a debated passage. People have a lot of different opinions as to what is meant by this part of the message. Just in my opinion, I think what God is doing here is that he is specifying his judgment upon those things that are necessary for the everyday sustenance, not so much the things that were considered essential, but yet they could live without. And so I think that God was specifying his judgment upon the things that they were going to need for their day-to-day sustenance. I'll quote John Walvoord here. He says, there would be no money left to buy other things, such as oil or wine, which were considered essential in biblical times. To put it in ordinary language, the situation would be such that one would have to spend a day's wages for a loaf of bread with no money left to buy anything else. The symbolism, therefore, indicates a time of famine when life will be reduced to the barest necessities. And so we're seeing already just how terrible things are going to be, and how they sort of just kind of build on top of one another. And then that leads us directly into the fourth seal, the last rider. If you're talking about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse here, as they're sometimes referred to. And so we get to the fourth seal and the fourth rider. And so look at verse number 7 there in Revelation chapter 6. And he says, and when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. And hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. And so, with this last horseman, John sees what can really only be described as kind of a ghastly sight. This particular horse there, it says there in verse number 8, is a pale horse. Now, this pale horse, the Greek word for that refers to kind of a sickly green, or maybe particularly a yellow, just a kind of a sickly color. And so this color represents the death that is the culmination of the 4 horsemen, of all the death and everything that's been going on in these particular seals. That is leading to this just tremendous number of people who will die in the course of this fourth rider. Now, John describes the rider as death, and then he says, and hell followed with him. Now, hell here is the Greek word Hades, and Hades can really refer to a lot of different things. It can refer to just a general place where the dead are held. It can refer to hell. It can also just simply refer to the grave. The word Hades is used for all of these, and the meaning fits within the word Hades. And so, to me, I really think that what John is describing here is just simply the grave. People are dying and they're going to the grave. This is just another picture of the death that is going to be happening under this seal, under the fourth rider. And so, again, everything about this seal is death. Death is just imminent in this particular time of the tribulation. And we see a tremendous death toll. You see there in verse number 8, power was given unto him. And again, we see there power was given unto him over the fourth part of the earth. And so a quarter of the earth's population at this time will be killed. And that comes with this the rider that has power, again, granted to him. And so he's under orders, essentially, is kind of what that's saying. A quarter. You're going to come, and a quarter of the earth is going to die. No more, no less. These are your orders, and this is the power that is given to him. And so, again, this is Christ's judgment. It's not the writer's judgment. This is the judgment of Christ. He is the Lamb that is opening the seals. He is the one who was worthy to take the book and open the seals. He is the one opening them. This is his judgment. This is his revelation. Now, we don't know how many people are going to be on the earth at this time. Because, again, I believe that the church is going to be raptured prior to these events taking place. And we don't know the number of people that will be raptured. We don't know the number of people that, just kind of assuming here, will die as a result of the rapture itself. I mean, you can only imagine what would happen when the rapture takes place and people are just gone. People who are, driving or doing all these other kinds of things. I think that when the rapture takes place, there's going to be a tremendous death toll. And so when you add the death of those who die as a result and the rapture itself, we don't know what the population is going to be, how many people are going to be on the earth at this particular time. But right now, just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about, right now, there are 7.8 billion people on the earth. That is the global population as we speak. And so with the results of the rapture and everything that we're talking about, we're still talking about well over 1 billion people dying as a result of these judgments. And so giving just a conservative estimate for the rapture and things like that, we're talking about well over 1 billion people dying as a result of the fourth seal being opened. And so we're talking about, a tremendous death toll. The world has really never seen anything that comes even close to that. 1 billion people dying, and we don't know the time span of these. We don't know how long this is going to take. But again, not that long, considering that, again, I believe that all four of these are going to take place in the first half. And so this is the fourth. So we're talking about not that long of a time period for 1 billion people, probably well over 1 billion people to die as a result of this particular seal. Now, there are four ways given for this death to happen in verse number 8. He says that is given a power of them to the fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, number 1, with hunger, number 2, and with death, number 3, and with beasts of the earth, number 4. Now, the first two, we've kind of already talked about. The first one, with the sword, that's the second seal. The second seal, the writer comes to bring war, and it specifically says he's bringing a sword. And so that's seal number 2. Number 3, or the second thing that he gives there is people are going to die from famine. Well, we talked about that in the last seal. That's seal number 3. And then he gives us two new ones here, death, which I think he's referencing pestilence, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And so death, and then, interestingly, the beast of the earth. And so John mentions death again after the sword and after famine. Now, as I said, I think this is talking about pestilence. And again, I take that from Matthew chapter 24, which again lines up with Revelation chapter 6. And so in Matthew chapter 24, again, verse number 7, that same verse that we've been referencing, pestilence is the next thing that Jesus mentions. And so it just makes sense to me that the death that John refers to here in verse number 8 is a death that is a result of pestilence during this particular time. And another thing to add on to that is that the sword, famine, and pestilence are actually, these three things are seen together a number of times in the Old Testament. I'll just give you 3 of them here, but there are others that I could have given you. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse number 9, it says, if when evil cometh upon us as the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine. And so we see there's sword, pestilence, and famine. We see them together. Jeremiah 14:12, I will consume them by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. And so again, we see the 3 together. Jeremiah 24:10, and I will send the sword, the famine, and the pestilence among them. And so it seems to stand to reason that these 3 things tend to kind of go together. And again, it makes sense as one kind of logically leads to the next. And so I think it's a very safe assumption that when he says death there, that is a reference to pestilence that would take place after the wars and the famines, that the sickness and disease would kind of take over. And so those three kind of make sense. Now, the fourth one is the one that maybe kind of seems a little bit out there. And so it makes sense that when there's wars and famine, that those things are going to take out and kill a lot of people. But then he specifically mentions here the beasts of the earth, and so this is kind of an interesting fourth thing that that John mentions here. Now, there is one other passage in the Bible where all four of these are mentioned together, these four specific particular judgments. And what I want you to notice about this is the wording of this verse. And the verse is Ezekiel chapter 14, verse number 21. And in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 17 also actually mentions all four of these together. But the wording of Ezekiel 14:21 is very interesting to me. And it says this: "For thus saith the Lord God, how much more when I send my four sore judgments upon Jerusalem, the sword and the famine and the noisome beast and the pestilence, to cut off from it man and beast." And so he specifically references there, when I send my four sore judgments. And so what I take away from this, when you see that this was a particular judgment of the Old Testament, now it's a particular judgment again under this fourth seal, it seems to suggest that these four things together are a special, particular judgment from God for some kind of wrongdoing, for a great immorality. And so it seems that these four things, when these four things happen together, this is special judgment from God. And we see that back in Ezekiel, and we see it again here in Revelation chapter 6. And so, again, the death toll that is happening when people thought that they were entering into, again, the utopia. They thought peace was happening. They thought this was coming to the earth. But what they get is war and famine and disease and death. And so they are going to be greatly deceived by this man who comes thinking they're getting one thing that is going to last, and yet getting the exact opposite. And now, just one more thing that I'll add here. As I've said a couple of times already, all of this takes place within the first 3.5 years. And so we understand that tribulation is a 7-year period. All of these things that we've talked about take place within that first half, the first 3.5 years. And yet, again, in Matthew 24, Jesus only calls this the beginning of sorrows. And so again, that word sorrows there in Matthew 24:8, that refers to birth pains. And so Jesus says this is just the beginning. And so things are only going to get worse from this point on, as God continues to pour out his wrath upon the earth. And all of it, again, as we'll see as we continue to go through the book of Revelation, all of it just builds and it culminates, and it just ends with the glorious return of Christ to the earth to fight in the battle of Armageddon. And so what we see here in Revelation chapter 6, these things are terrible. And it's really unlike anything that our world has ever seen. Yes, we've seen war, we've seen disease, we've seen famine, we've seen pest, we've seen these things, but not to this scale. Nothing that's ever been to this degree. Again, we're talking about conservatively over 1 billion people dying as a result of the fourth seal being opened. And so just some absolutely terrible things that are going to be taking place. And again, they're only getting worse. But what I do want to make sure that we see throughout all of this is that this is Christ's judgment. He's the Lamb. He's the one who took the scroll. He's the one opening the seals. And so it's important that we understand that he is the one in control of all of this. None of this that is happening in this future time of the tribulation. None of these things are happening outside of his control or outside of his will. It is all happening to his judgment, his perfect holy judgment, his perfect holy will. And so we may not understand why all of these things must take place, but we can have faith and we can trust in God that they're happening for reasons that they need to be happening. And so those are the first four seals. Next, we will take a look at the fifth seal, and we'll just talk about just what a terrible time this is, and the things that are going to be taking place, and how they really only get worse as they go on.